The set of The View hummed with a restless energy, a tension that could almost be felt in the air. Today's guest was none other than Senator John Neely Kennedy, known for his folksy charm and razor-sharp political insights. But this time there was something different. The room buzzed with anticipation, the lights brighter than usual, the audience's eyes glued to the screen. The topic for the day was nothing less than personal: the collapse of political integrity, the cost of fame, and the power of truth. As the camera panned, Kennedy sat across from Joy Behar, her ever-smiling face hiding a sharp wit, ready for a battle of words. Kennedy's calm demeanor was always his strength, but today something felt off. As Behar leaned forward, her voice dripping with sarcasm, she couldn't resist making a jab. "Senator Kennedy," she said with a sly grin, "you've made quite a name for yourself, haven't you? But let's be honest, behind the charming facade, what's left? You're just another politician, like the rest of them, aren't you?" The audience laughed nervously, sensing the shift in tone. Kennedy, who had faced sharper criticisms in his time, paused. His usual calmness was gone, replaced by a flicker of something deeper, something fierce. Behar continued, unaware of the storm she was unknowingly stirring. "You're great at giving speeches, but can you actually back up those words with action? Can you stand up without your suit and your tie and just be real for once?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with challenge. Kennedy's hands gripped the armrest of his chair. He could feel the weight of the room shift, the eyes of the audience suddenly no longer on him but on the drama unfolding. The nerves began to creep in, the soft thrum of doubt in his chest growing louder. The lights were blinding, the microphones hot with expectation. For a moment, his usual political mask faltered. His mind raced, memories of his past, the harsh criticisms, the judgments, the humiliations flashed through his mind. This wasn't just another political debate. This was about his character. This was personal. Joy's smirk deepened, almost as if she could smell his vulnerability. She leaned back in her chair, her voice dripping with mockery. "I bet you wouldn't last 5 minutes in our talent show next week. You wouldn't even make it past the first round. What do you say, Senator? Want to prove me wrong?" Kennedy's heart skipped a beat. He had been challenged, not by another politician, but by a fellow human being, someone who saw him not as a senator but as a man, a vulnerable one, just like anyone else. The room fell silent. The cameras were rolling, and for the first time in his life, Kennedy had a choice to make: sit back down and play the game, or stand up, step outside his comfort zone, and take the challenge head on. As the silence stretched, Kennedy's lips curled into a smile. Challenge accepted. The backstage of The View was a blur of lights, cameras, and buzzing crew members. But for Kennedy, everything felt distant, as if the world had faded into a quiet hum. He sat alone in the green room, staring into the mirror, his hands trembling slightly. His usual composure was slipping, and the reflection staring back at him was different, vulnerable, unsure. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. He'd accepted the challenge, and now the nerves were creeping up his spine. He had been through countless debates, faced political adversaries, and stood in front of millions. But today, this moment was different. This wasn't about policies or speeches. This was about being real, about facing his own demons. Kennedy's thoughts drifted back to a simpler time, to the days when he wasn't a senator, when he was just a boy in a small town in Louisiana. It was a life full of dreams, but also endless doubts, a place where everyone knew everyone, and the pressure to be somebody was as constant as the river's flow. Zachary, Louisiana, his hometown, a town where the land stretched for miles, and the people carried with them generations of stories and traditions. He'd grown up in a modest house with a mother who worked tirelessly, and a father who, though well-meaning, was often absent, lost in the world of his own shortcomings. But it was Miss Clara, his music teacher, who had seen something in him no one else had. When he was just 10 years old, he'd been an awkward, shy child. The other kids mocked him for his quiet demeanor, for his lack of athleticism, for being too bookish and not fitting in with the rough-and-tumble crowd. At school dances, he'd sit on the sidelines clutching a book or quietly listening to the conversations around him, the sounds of laughter and chatter only amplifying his loneliness. But then there was Miss Clara. She was old, frail even, but her presence had always been warm, her wisdom profound. She'd seen the boy hiding behind his glasses, behind his awkwardness, and had taken it upon herself to show him a different way. It was she who handed him the banjo, a worn instrument that had seen better days, but for Kennedy it was nothing short of a lifeline. "This," she had said, placing it in his hands, "is your voice. Don't be afraid to use it." He had laughed at first, a young boy unsure of what she meant, but as she'd sat beside him, showing him how to strum the strings, something inside him had begun to stir. He was no longer the quiet boy at the back of the class. The banjo became his voice, his outlet, his secret. In the quiet of his room, late at night, he'd practiced with a fervor that even he hadn't realized he was capable of. Music became his shield, his escape from the relentless teasing from the world that told him he didn't fit in. But as he grew older, life changed. High school came with its own set of pressures. His passion for music faded into the background as he focused on his studies, determined to leave Zachary behind. He had dreams, ambitions to do more, to be more. He wanted to be someone who mattered. It wasn't until years later, after law school, when he found himself in the world of politics, that he realized how much he'd buried. He became the polished politician, the one with the answers, the one who could stand in front of a crowd and deliver speeches that would bring people to their feet. But that boy, the one who had once played the banjo by the flickering light of his bedroom, had been buried beneath the suit and tie, hidden by the political persona he had created. Yet now, as he sat backstage, preparing for the talent show he'd just agreed to, Kennedy realized something. That boy was still inside him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed to let him out again. The sound of footsteps outside the green room snapped him back to reality. His assistant, Tommy, entered, his expression tense. "Senator, you're up in 5 minutes," Tommy said, but his eyes were drawn to Kennedy's distant gaze. "Are you all right?" Kennedy stared back at him, unsure how to answer. "I'm fine. Just thinking about something personal." Tommy raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. He knew better than to push Kennedy when he got like this. Kennedy had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with the weight of years behind him. Kennedy took a deep breath, his fingers instinctively tapping the wooden surface of the chair in front of him. He wasn't just going on that stage to prove a point to Joy Behar or anyone else. He was going on that stage to prove to himself that he wasn't just the polished politician, the man with the perfect speeches. He was still the boy with the banjo, the one who dared to step outside his comfort zone and play something real. The door to the green room swung open, and the studio assistant appeared. "Senator, they're calling you. It's time." Kennedy stood up, his mind clear now, his nerves steadying. He picked up his banjo from the chair, the familiar weight of it grounding him, reminding him of who he really was. "Let's go," he said, with a quiet smile that carried the weight of all the years that had led to this moment. The auditorium was buzzing, the energy palpable, but inside Kennedy's chest, the world felt like it was slowing down. He sat backstage, hands on the edges of the wooden banjo, his fingers tracing the smooth surface, lost in thought. The air was thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. In just moments, he would step onto that stage, not as a senator, not as the polished politician everyone expected, but as a man vulnerable, uncertain, and maybe even scared. The last few minutes had been a blur of preparations, quick glances and a barrage of nervous questions from the crew. But the real battle wasn't about the audience or the performance. It was the battle within. Could he do this? Could he really walk into that arena where every mistake would be amplified, where every mistake would be scrutinized, not just by the crowd, but by Joy Behar and the world watching? He could already hear the whispers of doubt in his mind, their voices growing louder. What if you mess up? What if they laugh at you? What if you're not good enough? His heartbeat quickened, the sound like a drum in his ears, but just as his thoughts began to overwhelm him, the door creaked open. Joy Behar's voice, sharp and cutting, drifted through the narrow hallway, reminding him of the challenge. She had been relentless all day. Every question she threw at him during the show was designed to poke at him, to weaken him, to make him second-guess every word that came out of his mouth. The taunts, the sarcasm, the constant questioning of his political decisions, of his values, all of it had taken its toll. Kennedy had fought back, of course, with his usual charm and wit. But Joy's challenge was different. It wasn't political. It was personal. The way she looked at him with that smug smile, daring him to show any weakness, daring him to slip up. Her words had been sharp, laced with mockery, designed to push him to the edge. She didn't just challenge his politics. She challenged his humanity, questioning whether he could ever be more than the persona he had so carefully crafted. That hit harder than any policy debate. A soft knock at the door brought him back to reality. It was Tommy, his assistant, his face a mix of concern and encouragement. "Senator, it's time. They're waiting for you," he said, voice steady but with an undercurrent of tension. Kennedy stood up, the weight of the banjo in his hands grounding him. He felt the eyes of the crew on him, the weight of their expectations settling on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. He walked toward the door, his feet dragging as though the hallway stretched on forever. As he stepped out into the bright lights, the crowd's buzz grew louder, their murmurs mixed with the hum of cameras and microphones. The room felt impossibly large, and yet the isolation he felt in the center of it all was suffocating. The sudden realization hit him. He wasn't just about to play music. He was about to face the world's judgment, the same world that had never truly seen him for who he was. His eyes scanned the room. And there she was, Joy Behar, sitting at the round table with a smirk plastered across her face. The same smirk she had worn earlier, when she had dared him to participate in this charade. Convinced that he would fail, convinced that he would crumble under the pressure. The tension between them was thick enough to slice through with a knife. Kennedy took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he walked to center stage. The spotlight was blinding, and he could feel the heat of it searing through his suit. The sound of the audience's murmurs began to fade, drowned out by the thundering noise in his own head. But then he heard it. Senator John Kennedy. The crowd erupted in applause, a mixture of excitement and curiosity. But it was muffled, distant, as though he were trapped in a tunnel. Kennedy felt his throat tighten. He adjusted the banjo in his hands, the familiar weight grounding him. But his fingers trembled as he strummed a few notes. Joy's voice broke through again, the sting of it cutting through his concentration. "Well, this ought to be good. Let's see if the senator can strum his way out of this one." The words pierced through him, and for a moment he wanted to turn and walk off the stage. The fear swelled within him, the same fear that had haunted him when he was a child, the fear of failing, of being laughed at. He had spent years building his career, his persona, perfecting his image. He was John Kennedy, the senator who could do no wrong. But in this moment he wasn't a senator. He was just a man with a banjo, and the world was waiting to see if he could make music, or be crushed by the weight of the world's expectations. As he stood there, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, he felt the eyes of the crowd on him, all of them waiting for him to make his move. The challenge was no longer just about music. It was about proving that he was more than just a politician. It was about showing them who he really was. The moment felt like it stretched on forever. And then, in the midst of the silence, Kennedy's mind cleared. He raised the banjo, feeling the strings beneath his fingers, and he made a decision. He wasn't here to win or lose. He was here to be real. He was here to show them that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about acting in spite of it. With a deep breath, he strummed the first chord, letting the sound fill the air. And in that moment, as the crowd fell silent, Kennedy finally felt it. The music. The banjo's familiar hum beneath his fingers, the rhythm of it carrying him back to a time when life was simpler, when he was just a boy learning to find his voice. And as he played, the tension slowly melted away, replaced by something else, the thrill of taking a risk, the joy of letting go. The tension in the auditorium was palpable, like a storm about to break. Kennedy's fingers hovered over the strings of the banjo, his breath shallow, his heartbeat racing in his chest. He'd taken the first step, but the second and the third still felt like a leap into the unknown. The crowd waited, eyes locked on him. He wasn't just a senator anymore, he wasn't even a man of politics. At that moment, he was simply a man about to bare his soul to the world, or risk falling flat. Joy Behar's voice echoed in his mind, the words sharp like daggers. "This ought to be good. Let's see if the senator can strum his way out of this one." Her taunt still lingered, stinging him, but there was no turning back. He took a deep breath and let his fingers strum across the banjo. The sound was shaky, tentative, but it filled the space in front of him. Kennedy's eyes flickered to the audience, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and perhaps the faintest hint of judgment. For a moment, he wanted to walk off. He wanted to throw down the banjo and walk out of the room, back to the world of suits and speeches where everything was controlled. But as his eyes fell on the worn strings, Memories began to flood back. Memories of a time when things were simpler. Zachary, Louisiana, a time when he had first picked up the banjo in Miss Clara's living room, a time when the music had been his only escape, his only way of speaking his truth. He could still remember the way Miss Clara had smiled at him, her hands steady and firm on the banjo, teaching him the rhythm, the heart of the music. "This is your voice," she had told him. "Use it. Don't be afraid to show who you really are." In that moment, Kennedy knew what he had to do. The voice inside him, the one that had been hidden beneath layers of political rhetoric and public expectations, spoke louder than ever before. "I'm not just a politician," he whispered to himself, his fingers pressing down on the strings again. "I'm a man of my word. I'm a man of music." He began to play again, this time more confidently, his fingers moving across the strings with the ease of someone who had learned to find their rhythm long ago. The song was simple, Jolie Blonde, a classic Sinjun tune, but in that moment it felt like it was everything. His voice joined the banjo, raw and unpolished, carrying the weight of his past, his struggles, and his dreams. But just as he thought he had found his rhythm, the unthinkable happened. The sound of a string snapping echoed through the auditorium. It was a sharp, almost mocking sound cutting through the music, breaking the spell. Kennedy froze, his fingers still poised on the strings, the silence hanging heavily in the air. For a brief moment, he considered stopping. He could feel the eyes on him, the judgment, the expectations. He could already hear the whispers. "I told you he couldn't do it. He's just a politician, not a musician." But then, something inside him clicked. This wasn't about perfection. It was about realness. It was about accepting the flaws and showing the world that even in the face of failure, you could stand tall. He looked down at the broken string, then back up at the audience. He could feel the weight of their eyes waiting for him to crumble, waiting for him to walk off the stage in shame. But instead, Kennedy smiled. It was a small smile, a quiet one, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned over the years. "Well, that's one way to make a point," he said, his voice steady, a hint of humor in his tone. The crowd chuckled nervously, their tension easing just slightly. But Kennedy knew that the battle wasn't over yet. He had to finish what he had started. "I'm not perfect," he continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, locking onto Joy Behar's face for a moment. Her expression had shifted slightly from smug amusement to something else, uncertainty, maybe even a hint of respect. "I never claimed to be, but I'm real. And if that offends you, then maybe that's the point." The crowd fell into a stunned silence. Kennedy stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't just playing for the audience. He wasn't just playing for Joy or the cameras. He was playing for himself, for the man he had been and the man he had become. "This is me," he said quietly, before he picked up the broken banjo string and gave it a quick, practiced twist. In the back of the room, Kennedy noticed a figure. Tommy, his assistant, was standing near the door, his face tense. Behind him, the faint glow of a camera flashed. Kennedy's heart skipped a beat. The news crew was there, ready to capture every moment, waiting for him to falter. He could feel the pressure mounting, but instead of buckling, he took another deep breath and pressed on. "And this," Kennedy said, his voice stronger now, his fingers gripping the strings with more confidence, "is for everyone who thinks they can't be who they are, for everyone who's been told they don't belong, for everyone who's been judged. This is for you." The room, which had been full of skepticism and judgment just moments before, began to shift. The murmurs turned into silence, and then, slowly, the sound of applause began to build. The crowd, once unsure, began to understand. Kennedy's voice rang out, more powerful than before, his song weaving through the auditorium. And in that moment he knew, this wasn't just about music. This was about reclaiming who he was, about standing up, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been silenced, laughed at, or told they didn't matter. The sound of Kennedy's fingers brushing over the broken string echoed in his mind, reverberating through the silence in the auditorium. For a fleeting moment he could feel every eye on him, expectant, judgmental, calculating. The pressure was suffocating. The weight of all his years in politics, the reputation he had built as the untouchable senator, seemed to be cracking at the seams. Here on this stage there was no Senate, no cameras, no prepared speeches. There was only him, a man and a banjo, and a crowd waiting for him to falter. But despite the tightness in his chest and the sweat forming on his brow, Kennedy knew one thing. He had a choice. He could stand there frozen, terrified of making a mistake, or he could let go, embrace the imperfection and take a risk. For the first time in years, he wasn't just performing for an audience, he was performing for himself. As he looked out across the stage, the weight of the moment seemed to lift. Kennedy inhaled deeply, feeling the air fill his lungs, and slowly, with a steadying hand, he adjusted the banjo's string again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the ideal sound he had hoped for, but it was enough. "Let's get this right," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible but filled with determination. His fingers wrapped around the neck of the banjo again, the familiar motion now calming him, grounding him in the reality of what he was doing. He wasn't performing for the cameras, he wasn't performing for Joy Behar, or for the judgment of the world. He was performing for the boy who had once sat in his room, strumming a banjo late at night, dreaming of a future that felt impossible. It was the sound of his voice that truly caught his attention. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. The way the notes rang out, rough and raw, felt like an expression of everything he had buried inside him for so long. It wasn't about a perfect performance. It was about embracing who he was, flaws and all. The crowd was no longer just hearing a song. They were witnessing a man confronting the parts of himself he had long buried, the parts he had kept hidden for the sake of his public image. The applause that had started to build earlier now swelled, and Kennedy could feel the shift. He wasn't just being heard, he was being seen. The audience was no longer waiting for him to fail. They were waiting to witness something unexpected, something genuine. And just like that, a sudden burst of clarity washed over him. He stopped mid-song, not because of the broken string, but because the moment felt too important, too defining to let it slip away. The crowd, too, seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something was about to change. He hadn't just taken the stage to prove something to the audience. He had taken the stage to reclaim himself. "You know," Kennedy said, his voice calm but filled with the weight of years of reflection, "I'm not here to win your approval. I'm not here to be perfect. I'm here because I've learned something over the years." The audience, once nervous, once uncertain, grew still. There was something different in his voice, something more powerful than just the politics of it all. He wasn't a senator right now. He was a man standing in front of them, raw and vulnerable, willing to risk everything for one moment of authenticity. He paused, allowing the silence to linger, drawing out the suspense, before he continued. "I've spent my life hiding behind titles, behind this mask that everyone expects me to wear. But I'm here to tell you that I'm more than the speeches you hear on TV. I'm more than the votes I cast or the laws I fight for. We're all more than our titles, aren't we? But it's easy to forget that, to get lost in the roles we play." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the audience unsure of what to make of this revelation. It wasn't just a senator speaking anymore, it was a man, a person. Kennedy could feel the weight of the truth in his words, the depth of his vulnerability. He had finally stepped out from behind the polished political persona, showing the world the man who had been hiding all along. And it was terrifying, but it was also the most freeing thing he had ever done. The moment hung in the air, thick with emotion, before he began again, this time with even more conviction. "You see, I've been afraid to show this side of myself, afraid of the judgment, of the ridicule. But the truth is, fear is the greatest obstacle we face. Fear of being laughed at, fear of not being good enough, fear of failure. And if I'm honest with you, I've been running from that fear for far too long." The vulnerability in his voice cut through the tension in the room. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kennedy was no longer just the man on the pedestal. He was human, raw and real. The audience could feel it. They weren't just watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing a transformation. With a deep breath, he began to play again. This time, the notes were stronger, more confident. The rhythm flowed easily beneath his fingers, and with each strum, he felt the weight of the past lifting off his shoulders. The music wasn't just sound anymore, it was his story, his truth, and it felt as though the entire room was moving with him. Every chord carried the weight of his journey, from the shy boy in Zachary to the man standing on that stage, confronting his fear head-on. And when the final note of the song rang out, the room erupted, but this wasn't just polite applause. It was raw, it was real, and it was heartfelt. The crowd wasn't just clapping for his performance. They were applauding the courage it took for him to stand there and be vulnerable. Kennedy took a step back, his heart racing, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he felt lighter, freer. He had done it. He had proven something not to anyone else, but to himself. The fear had not only been faced, it had been conquered. As the applause continued, Kennedy's gaze found Joy Behar, sitting in the front row, her expression no longer mocking, but softened, perhaps even moved. For the first time that day, there was respect in her eyes, and as Kennedy stepped off the stage, the weight of everything that had come before him felt just a little bit lighter. The air in the community center was thick with anticipation. The crowd's applause still echoed in Kennedy's ears, a hum of sound that swirled around him as he walked off the stage. The lights were blinding, the noise dizzying, but inside him there was only a calm. He had done it. For the first time in his life, he had stepped out of the comfort zone of politics and image. And now, as the applause still rang in his ears, he felt a deep sense of peace settle in. But there was no time to revel in the victory. The competition wasn't over yet. Derek, the bully who had dared him to take part, was still there. The cameras were still rolling, and the room was buzzing with excitement, the air electric with expectation. Kennedy wasn't finished yet, and he knew it. As he made his way back to the dressing room, the reality of the moment sank in. He was a politician, a man who had stood on the world stage making decisions that affected millions. Yet today, he wasn't playing for votes or headlines. He had stood up on that stage and bared his soul, his imperfections, his vulnerabilities. And now, in the aftermath, the questions swirling in his mind weren't about his political career. They were about who he was as a man. The backstage area was a whirl of motion, crew members rushing around, adjusting microphones, setting up for the next act. Joy Behar was still sitting in her chair, watching him intently, a curious expression on her face. For a moment, their eyes met, and Kennedy felt a flicker of something unexpected: respect. It was fleeting, gone before he could fully grasp it, but it was there. Behind him, he could hear Derek's voice. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. "Your uncle's a joke," he heard Derek laugh, the words dripping with scorn. Kennedy felt the old anger rise in him, a simmering heat in the pit of his stomach. He had been ridiculed, laughed at, and judged for his entire life. But now it wasn't just about him. It was about something more. Turning toward the voice, Kennedy took a deep breath. "This was the moment. You think I'm a joke?" he called out, his voice steady, almost calm. He could feel the eyes of the room turn toward him. Derek stopped mid-laugh, a puzzled expression crossing his face. "I'll show you what a joke is," Kennedy continued, his voice low, almost menacing. "But not here, not now. This isn't for you." The crowd was silent now, sensing the change in his tone. For the first time, they saw the real John Kennedy, the man who wasn't afraid to confront his demons, to face his own flaws. The room felt smaller, the tension thickening as Kennedy stepped forward, his hands clenched by his sides. The dramatic confrontation with Derek was more than just a battle of egos. It was the final test of his courage. He wasn't just facing a bully anymore. He was facing the deepest parts of himself, the self-doubt, the fear of failure, and the fear of being seen for who he truly was. Derek's smirk faltered as he looked up at Kennedy. The audience, once skeptical, now leaned in, waiting for the next move. "I've spent my life trying to prove something to people like you," Kennedy continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "trying to show that I'm worthy of respect. But the truth is, respect isn't given. It's earned. And I've earned mine, not by being perfect, but by owning who I am." The room was still. The seconds stretched on like hours. Derek, for the first time, seemed to shrink, his earlier bravado slipping away. He looked around the room as if searching for the support he once had. But it was gone. The crowd, the audience, the people who had been waiting for Kennedy to fail were now silent, watching the showdown unfold. Kennedy stepped back, his gaze moving over the crowd one last time. He could feel the weight of their expectations, but this time, he wasn't afraid. The fear that had held him captive for so long was slipping away, replaced by something stronger: self-acceptance. "I'm done," Kennedy said, the words simple but powerful. "Done with pretending. Done with trying to be something I'm not. If you think I'm a joke, then that's your problem. But this," he gestured to the stage, the banjo, and the crowd, "this is real, and you can't take that away." With that, he turned and walked back toward the stage, leaving Derek and the hushed crowd behind him. The tension that had been thick in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a new energy, a sense of respect not just for the senator, but for the man who had dared to be vulnerable in front of the world. As Kennedy took his seat at the edge of the stage, he glanced over at Joy. This time her gaze wasn't taunting or mocking. It was thoughtful, almost appreciative. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging the courage it had taken to stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. The final act was about to begin, but Kennedy's victory had already been won. Not in the applause, not in the cameras, but in the quiet victory of confronting his own fears. For the first time, he wasn't playing for the crowd. He was playing for himself. The audience's applause had begun to subside, but the warmth of their respect still lingered in the air. Kennedy sat on the edge of the stage, his breath still heavy from the final moments, the weight of what had just happened settling in. The once sharp and judgmental voices that had echoed in his mind had quieted, replaced by something more peaceful, more confident. He had taken the challenge, faced his fears, and come out stronger on the other side. Behind him, the cameras continued to roll, capturing every detail of the aftermath. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the adrenaline of performing or the pressure of the showdown with Derek, but from the realization that for the first time, he had let the world see who he really was. The polished senator, the perfect public figure, was gone. What remained was the true man beneath the suit, the politician who was also a human, full of flaws, fears, and yes, courage. Kennedy stood up slowly, the applause now building into a steady rhythm. He could hear it, but he didn't feel the need to look around or bow. The moment wasn't about the approval of others. It was about the approval he had finally given himself. As he walked toward the back of the stage, he saw Joy Behar waiting for him. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable, but as he approached, she didn't offer a sharp retort or a biting comment. Instead, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. She didn't need to say anything. The respect in her eyes spoke volumes. This was the real victory, not the one he had expected, but the one he had earned on his own terms. "You did it," she said simply, her voice softer than usual. Kennedy didn't respond immediately. He had no words to offer, not just to her, but to anyone. He had spent years living his life for others, for the headlines, for the expectations of those around him. But today, for the first time in his career, he had done something just for himself. Behind him, Derek's smirk had faded, replaced by an awkward silence. The boy had once believed he could bring down the senator with a challenge, a joke at his expense. But now, as the reality of what had happened began to sink in, there was nothing left for him to say. Kennedy had not only survived the challenge, he had redefined it. The rest of the room was still buzzing with the aftermath. The cameras that had once been pointed at him, poised to capture his downfall, were now capturing something different. A transformation, a revelation. As the production crew began to pack up, Kennedy's eyes met Lily's. She had been watching from the back of the room, her expression a mixture of pride and awe. She had seen him struggle, had heard the doubts that had weighed on his shoulders in private moments, and now she saw the man who had stood before everyone, had bared his flaws and had come out victorious. In the end, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the silent understanding between them, the recognition that he had done something real. He walked toward her, his stride steady, his mind clearer than it had been in years. "You were amazing, Uncle John," she said, her voice trembling just slightly with emotion. There was no mockery, no taunt in her words, only pure, unfiltered admiration. Kennedy smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. He hadn't smiled like that in years, not even for the cameras. "Thank you, Lily," he said softly. "This was for me, but also for you, for everyone who's ever felt like they couldn't be themselves." Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with pride. She had witnessed a transformation, not just in him, but in herself as well. She had always admired her uncle, but today she saw him as something more, a man who faced the world with courage, despite his flaws, despite the odds. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being true. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but Kennedy didn't rush. He stood there with Lily for a moment, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. He had walked into that room a politician, but he was leaving it a man who had finally come to terms with who he was. Imperfections, flaws and all. "I'm proud of you," Lily whispered, and it was then that Kennedy realized She wasn't just talking about the performance. She was talking about everything. And just as the last of the crowd filed out and the lights began to dim, Kennedy knew that he would never be the same again. The man who had walked onto that stage was gone, and in his place stood someone stronger, someone who had dared to be real. As he stepped out of the building, the cool night air hit his face, and for the first time in a long time, Kennedy felt free. He didn't need anyone's approval, not even his own party's. He had nothing left to prove. He was ready to walk into the future, unafraid of failure, and knowing that the real victory had already been won, not in the eyes of the world, but in his heart.